start with a poem. And what I wanted to share today was the poem Allow by Dana Folds. I feel like it's appropriate both to facilitation, particularly online facilitation, but also for the time that we're navigating right now with everything that is going on. Allow. There is no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt, containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in. The wild and the weak, fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of the heart or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. In the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your new eyes. So thanks for joining us today, everyone. We're excited to be talking about both practical elements of preparing for a meeting, any meeting that you might be facilitating, but particularly given our times, a virtual meeting. And there's going to be a combination of the technical aspects of that, and then a lot of the heart and gut aspects of that, the mood, the way in which we use culture and how we design for accessibility. And we wanted to remind folks, if you weren't able to make it last week or review the video, that there are 4 different pieces of this work that's going to be previewed today. One, we're going to do these every session. One is change around emergent strategy and broader context. We'll talk more about emergent strategy in just a moment. Culture, specifically talking about racial equity, racial justice, and trauma-informed design, but culture has much broader applications than just those elements. Creativity, which is modeling styles, structures, and tools. Everything that we're doing is modeling here, including the shift I will make soon because there's a leaf blower in the background, and I apologize for the background noise. And then caring, most importantly, for ourselves, and we want to be modeling that during this call, starting with poetry as part of that, for our families and our workplaces, for our broader community, and for the world. As I quoted last time, Adrienne Marie Brown writes that she thinks of facilitation as a grand act of love. And so we really want to come to these sessions with that for what we're sharing with you, but for what you all have to contribute as well and what we're going to be doing together. And we just wanted to offer some virtual interaction guidelines as well. We want to invite you to be aware of how much you're talking or not talking. So the acronym we use is WAIT, why am I talking? We want to encourage you, especially with this virtual format, it's really challenging to be present. So we want to encourage you to be here. We just started with a poem. Ashley did a last time, just having us breathe and feel our bodies. And that's accessible, even if we're not leading you in that, that's accessible to you at any point. You might want to even feel that right now. Where is my mind? Where is my body? Where is my breath? And just take a few deep breaths as we're doing this introductory piece. We want to welcome new ideas and use new tools and techniques. We joked last time that you would never necessarily use everything that we're going to preview for you in one meeting. It would be kind of like taking everything from the buffet and your plate would be spilling over and it just doesn't leave enough space. But we also want to be able to model and share new ideas with you. And again, being caring, taking care of yourself and others. So if that means just standing up in the middle of our session today and stretching out, we will have a stretch and a body break, but I want to encourage you to do that as well.
Great, thanks, Odin. So we're going to shift, and at the end of our last session, we asked this question for you all to think about in terms of what is your cultural superpower that you bring to facilitation. And so here's my grandmother's cast iron skillet. And I bring this as like an example of hospitality as a Southerner. And just for me, that's like one of the things I bring in terms of facilitation. So you're going to move into dyads in a moment, and you're each going to share your answer to that question of like, what's your cultural superpower that you bring to facilitation? And the second question that you're going to share with your partner is, what characteristic do you have that makes you feel like you would be good at facilitation? And so some of us are really great listeners. Some of us are really good at like synthesizing. There are a variety of skills that we use out in the world in our organizing work and our project management work. How do we then translate that into facilitation? So those are your two questions to share with your partner, and you'll have 5 minutes. What is a cultural superpower you bring to facilitation? And what characteristic do you have that makes you feel like you could be good at this? Cool. We'll see you all in 5 minutes. Enjoy your time with your partner. Cool. Welcome back, folks. We hope that you had good conversations. In the chat box, I want to invite you all to just reflect on what some of your superpowers are. And if there's anybody who wants to share, but also just pop into the chat box, like, what are your superpowers? See? Can you just raise your physical hand or a hands up if you also share that one? Just kind of curious. Yeah. So I see at least 2 other people have empathy. Great. Curiosity. Oh, Maria, I appreciate you lifting up someone else's superpower that you heard. Yes. April, creating magic, agility, flexibility, curiosity, food. Yes. Being open-minded. Isabel, can you tell us a little bit more about that and why, and if this, as a facilitator, that's a really important skill to bring?
Yeah, when I was speaking with my partner, I mentioned that, and I said that I think being open-minded really allows you to see other people's perspectives and to kind of incorporate that in how you're facilitating, and potentially being able to view things from a different perspective and like see the other side of something that you're discussing, so you have a more like holistic idea of how people are approaching something.
Awesome. And humor and listening. It's nice to see those lifted up. Cool. So we all many of us actually share these. And so just remembering in those moments of like, I don't know what I'm doing as a facilitator, which happened to me this morning. Like thinking about this great list and being like, right, what can I pull from my pocket and lean into today in this moment, and making a choice of like, you know what, today I'm really going to lean into curiosity and see what that opens up for you. But just knowing you've got this beautiful toolkit with you. Sage, you want to tell us about emergent strategy?
Absolutely, and what an elegant handoff. Thank you. Because we're going to talk about a couple of other things that you can add to your toolkit. And so we're going to spend a little time. Last session, we spent some time with the principles of emergent strategy. Today, we're going to spend some time with the elements. There are 6 elements. And when you're thinking about your facilitation, these elements can help you when you find yourself in a moment of pivot. They are great to kind of go back to see where am I in my facilitation, exercising these things, either personally or in how I have built the framework that people are engaging in. And so the first one is fractals. And fractals, yeah, I'm going to actually, if someone could unmute and read the slide, we'll just go through them and different people will read them.
Fractal, how we are at the small scale is how we are at the large scale.
Next slide.
Mutual reliance, shared leadership, and vision.
Interdependence and decentralization. Thank you, Catherine.
Intentional adaptation, how we live and grow and stay purposeful in the face of constant change.
Non-linear and iterative.
And the tagline, Ella?
How do I/we learn from this?
Resilience and transformative justice. Everything given time and nurturing is moving toward balance and healing. Lisa Thomas at DEMO.
Creating more possibilities, where we shape tomorrow towards abundance.
You can stop the slideshow, Ashley. Thank you all for that. One of the things that I just want to highlight is, particularly in online spaces or even in facilitation in general, one of the things you get very good at is patience. You know, we say things in Emergent strategy, some of our principles we talked about was like trust the people and the people become trustworthy. Meaning I have to resist an urge when there is silence, if that is my predilection, to fill it. Because as a facilitator, I'm trusting you all, right, to be my co-creators. So when I ask things like, you know, will you read the slide? And there's that, we all have that like 40-second thing of like, oh, fine, I'll do it, right? Like, you just let people come to it as they come to it. And that's a really important way in which you build a container that doesn't always center your voice as facilitator. I come from a practice that encourages like an 80-20. Like as a facilitator, I should be speaking 20% and the rest of the body of folks I'm working with will be speaking 80%. So I've dropped into the chat these elements of Emergent strategy, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we think about them in relationship to facilitation. So fractals, the relationship between the small and the large. This can show up in a number of different ways. You can think about fractals in relationship to how often you are doing small group conversations to full group conversations, right? And throughout your facilitation, are people talking in 2s, 3s, 8s? What conversation actually fits best with how people are gathering to have the conversation? Intentional adaptation, how we change. I think one of the superpowers we heard earlier was around being open-minded. Right? We talked a little bit about this. Oftentimes when you're coming to facilitation, you have actually worked pretty darn hard to build an agenda. You've thought through the different pieces. You have, researched things that you thought was going to be helpful, and you get into the room and folks are like, yeah, actually, what you find out is they need something else. The room is calling for something else. They're calling for more time in one part of the agenda. They're calling for a deeper, you get halfway into a conversation and you realize, oh, these folks are having two different conversations. We need to realign and make sure that we are having the same conversation. The ability to adapt is really important, and how you do that is related to our conversations around how oppressions work, who has the power, who is making decisions. And I would encourage as a facilitator, again, not as you're not an ED, you're a facilitator, supporting the group in understanding where they want to go and supporting them getting there. Interdependence and decentralization, that goes directly to what I was just speaking about around how much are you sharing the space with the folks that you are facilitating. How much are they hearing each other's voices? We want to really make the distinction and we want to make a difference, not just distinction, between teaching, training, and facilitating. These are three different things. If your voice is the most present voice, you might have leaned more towards a training than facilitation. Right? These are different things. So when you think about interdependence and decentralization, in the development of your engagement, who are you talking to? Who are the folks who are engaged in the shaping of a thing? Is it just the ED, or is it someone else inside the organization, or someone who's coming? Do you have a collective body that's helping you build the agenda? once you are actually in the facilitation, really resist the urge to feel it all on you. Share it with the folks. Ask them questions. Have them engaged in the ecosystem. And that way we have a larger sense of brilliance around what's happening. Not just what you know, but how are you collecting and gathering information from the group about where they want to go. And then you support them getting there. Nonlinear and iterative is the pace and the pathway to change. The idea is we're facilitating folks for a reason, like to do something, to move something, to build something, to grow something. And the pace and pathway of that, sometimes you don't know until you're actually in the group with them. You can do all the kind of thinking and assessments ahead of time, but you want to be able to go back to things if it feels like when you've gotten in front of a conversation, you know, you feel like there's a decision made, or you all thought there was a decision made, but the conversation is coming back up again. You're like, oh, we didn't actually land this for the entire body. So let's go back and make sure that we land this so that we can all move forward together. So don't, this is an encouragement, like to avoid the need to get through a thing, like to get to the end. You want to get to the end together. And in order to do that, sometimes you have to move back and forth along your timeline of information. And sometimes things change and they become different. A different conversation is emerging that if you don't have, you can't move them forward. Resilience and transformative justice. We'll talk a little bit about that, but how do we recover from harm? We'll do a section on agreements and things like that. But I think it's really important, both in virtual spaces, in mixed race spaces, to be thinking about, as a facilitator, what is transformative justice and how does this body recover from harm when it happens? I like to say, we are all human beings. We, actually, I don't know that that's true. Let me back up. That's very speciesist of me. I don't make any assumptions. But we know that we are all going to make mistakes, right? And we are all going to trip at some point. We are going to step on each other's toes. We're going to accidentally talk over each other because we're so excited. Things are going to happen when you bring bodies together in a space. And what we want to do is not try and be so concerned about how to avoid that, but really, what do we do once it happens? Because that's the forward movement, right? That's the body movement. And so that's why agreements are wonderful, and like how do you, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to navigate when difficulties show up. And creating more possibility, how do we move towards life? Another way to phrase this that sometimes I do is, how do we create a culture of curiosity? Right? We want to move folks through in a way that keeps the momentum going, that there's a rhythm to this, that each piece is interconnected to the next piece, so that we're actually, so that through the facilitation together, we're moving somewhere. And that really can be important, because sometimes it feels like our conversations can circle and it seems like we're creating more possibility, but we're actually saying some of the same things in a bunch of different ways, right? You'll see that in a group. And as a facilitator, you're like, okay, so then I'm needing to listen to this conversation deeply and figure out what moves us towards more life, rather than getting sort of in an echo chamber of, yeah, that's true, and I look at it this way, and I look at it that way. It gives you an opportunity to think about, what's the question that's gonna pop folks into another possibility, right? It's gonna pop them into, oh, okay. Well, that sounds really important. How about if we think about it from this perspective of a person who's living in this body, right? Like, or you can come up with a bunch of different questions, and we have different lists of questions that we've sent you. And so those are the elements of emergent strategy. And those is a little bit about how that can happen in a facilitation framework. And I've got about a few minutes left. And so I would love to hear from you all, and you can type into the chat just how you imagine one of these might happen in a facilitation space. How would you create more interdependence? What are tools that you use to create, to adapt? when something is, when a new conversation is needing to be born, how do you usher folks into that conversation? Questions, thoughts? Thank you, Ashley. Okay. So creating potential connections between participants. You'd be surprised if you throw a bunch of pipe cleaners in the middle of a table and you tell adults to build something together, what happens, right? What are the ways in which you are creating connections, how they are using each other and supporting the brilliance of each other to create something. Thank you, Francisca. Layla, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Maria, can you say a little bit more about that? Like when you say less obvious connections?
I was just thinking some conversations I've been in where, like if you're talking about affordable housing, and it may be easy to start the conversation from housers and housing and all of that, but if you actually can kind of flip it and pull out and maybe start the conversation around schools or public health or some of the other ways that people connect to it that they may feel they have more of a understanding of than like housing finance. So
thank you. And for myself, I have a facilitation commitment, and one of the things I say is I want people to leave spaces with me being surprised by what they came up with for themselves. Right? I don't need you to be like, she's a great facilitator. What I want you to be like, wow, look at what I did. I'm so surprised by myself. What are you holding? What are you holding? I appreciate that, Ella, in this time, which is why, again, things like check-ins are really important, right? Because if people in the group are having, are carrying their lives, we are all carrying our lives with us everywhere we go. If we don't take a moment to check in, name that, open with a poem, like something that helps us ground our humanity, not just focus, folks. Because sometimes that's what it feels like. You're just trying to get focused so we can do the work. But really, how do we understand how people are showing up, connect to our humanity, so that we can all hold each other and move forward in the process, right? All right. And my timer went off, which means I am going to pass it to the next person in our agenda, which I'm coming to. Owen.
Hey, thank you, Sage. So I just want everybody, before we go into some more content, that was so rich and so foundational in terms of what it is that we want to share with you and that we want to have, you know, that our values kind of dictate should show up in facilitation. I just want everyone to take a deep breath, just to really just recharge. You know, we've been sitting for a little while. Yeah, if you want to just do a quick little stretch, we're going to do a stretch break in about 10 or 12 minutes, but just to take all of that in, because it's so important. And a lot of what we're doing, and we mentioned this last time, is setting up a foundation for the foundation. Is really, as they say in gardening, you know, it's like you don't grow the plant, you grow the soil. So what we're doing here is talking about, I mean, emergent strategy is about growing the soil. Doing work and understanding the importance of culture is about growing the soil. Looking at something from a human perspective in your facilitation is growing the soil, and that richness allows the plants to grow and to thrive. So what I would love to do is just go through a little bit of what people think about as the nuts and bolts of facilitation, but really what it is these are the plants, these are the seeds that we plant that then emerge from that soil that we have enriched so that it can really grow strong facilitation for ourselves, and then that translates nicely to other folks. So this is, if we're talking about what happens before a meeting, oftentimes we use the age-old expression, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And your ounce of prevention, which is really important for any meeting, virtual or face-to-face, is that sense of, you know, how do I want to prepare for this myself, but also prepare people who are participating so that we can get the most out of it. So I could create some metaphor about the kitten, but it's really just to attract your attention. And one thing that I would say is this meeting necessary? Especially now with all of us spending so much time on the screen. Is it necessary? And what type of meeting is it? Oftentimes people don't think about that, but it's really important when we're thinking about how we're designing our agenda and what it is that we need to get out of the meeting. And there's one of the juicy links in your agenda is called 7 Types of Meetings. And it's just a really clear overview of different kinds of meetings you might be involved in. It's not exhaustive, but it gives you that sense of what you might want to think of when you're structuring a meeting. You also, and this is incredible, I can't stress this enough, what are you doing to get input from and engage your participants before the meeting particularly, but then during the meeting, as you're seeing us doing with getting input from you in the chat and having you break into small groups? Do you know who's attending? Are you asking questions around what are your expectations? What are your accessibility needs? What is it that is most important for you? You know, what does wild success look like in this meeting for you? And then I think it's also really important, Sage mentioned this, we mentioned this last time, to think about trauma-informed design. And another juicy link in your agenda is a piece that my colleague Ari and a number of her colleagues put together, which is an open document, and it's resources for trauma-informed design, which is how are you structuring a meeting where you're really trying to attend to the whole person, to everyone who's there, and to however they're showing up, and to allowing that, as our poem started with, right? Allow and invite, and then make adjustments for and have ways in which people can show up as their full selves, whatever that means for them in that day. And then I just want to go back to some of our Emergent strategy principles and share less prep, more presence. For all these things that we've talked about, just showing up as your full self can be the most powerful thing you can do as a facilitator. So this is just a little bit when we're thinking about pre-agenda planning. So even before you put together the agenda, this is a really good virtual meeting design checklist from Beth Cantor, who's, you know, really done a lot of thinking around online communities and virtual meeting design, even pre-COVID. But this is really nice as just a quick reference for, here are some of the things that I should think about. And then when you're designing an agenda, one of the pieces that is really critical is what's called POP. And you might have heard of this. It is purpose, outcomes, and process. So when we're designing an agenda, what's the purpose of this meeting? What are the outcomes we want to see? And then what's the process we're going to go through to get to those outcomes? So when you develop an agenda, these are some, we'll come back to this in our third session around tools for group dialogue, but these are some of the practices that you can weave into any agenda. Brainstorming, we're breaking you into breakout groups. Roving conversations, do you visit different breakout rooms or different places around the room? And are there one-on-one sessions? Are we doing things in working groups? But some of these important questions to ask when you're developing an agenda: how much time do you have? The pacing is so important, particularly if we're thinking about things at a human scale and we're trying to be sensitive to trauma. Oftentimes we jump right into wanting to get the results and rushing right through conversations and decisions. How much time do you have is really an invitation to slow down and create space as much as possible. We'll be talking about that a little bit later in this session. What's the most important thing to focus on? Take the laundry list and pare it down to 1 or 2 things, whether you're meeting for an hour or 2 hours or a half day or longer. Always beginning with some kind of a welcome and a check-in, even if it's a group like this of 30, 40, 50 people, and you can't do introductions all the way around. Is there a way that people can show up and be present and feel like they're being invited and welcome? Ashley's going to talk a little bit later about agreements. This is a really important part of that ounce of prevention, and maybe it's more than an ounce, but it is absolutely critical in any meeting or process or learning session that there are agreements that are clear and that those are woven into part of the POP, the purpose, the outcomes, and the process. And then it's really critical. Oftentimes we rush the ending. We'll talk a lot about that in our 4th session together in mid-October, but leaving enough time to close and review next steps. So I just want to give you an example of a couple different kinds of agendas. This is one which is really hard to see, but you'll be able to zoom in on your own version of this slide deck if you want to review it. This was an agenda from a meeting I did for the IFA folks, a kind of sister initiative to SPARCC that many of you either know about or might have been involved in or heard of. And when the pandemic started, we had to move our triannual. We were supposed to be in New York on March 12th and 13th, and it just turned out that we did this virtually. So here's the agenda. And this could look like the agenda for any meeting. It just is switched around a little in terms of spacing and timing. And then we also have our own agenda for this meeting. Ashley's going to share that as well. This is a slightly different format, less narrative and more of a tabular style. So you can see here we are, and there are different columns where it shows you who the facilitator is. We found out a fun way to do bullet points, which keeps things interesting. And then we have the links that we've provided for you and for other things that we're referring to. So that's just another example of an agenda that you might design and use. And there are a million templates. We can share that with all of you. And yeah, just wanted to share those pieces. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I want to mention. But yeah, there's just one other thing. We've talked about this already, but this idea of multiple ways of knowing, and that in your design, we want to think about that so that we're not doing the same thing over and over again, but we're really accounting for different learning styles, different approaches that people might have, and that we take the time to do that. We have breaks. We have one coming up in a couple minutes. And that, you vary the group sizes. Sage mentioned that earlier. And there's something woven in that's allows people to connect with themselves and with each other. And just remember what I always love to say, and this is an expression that a million people use for different reasons, but when you're designing an agenda, the map is not the territory. So you have intentions and feel like, oh, this is the best agenda I've ever put together. And all that stuff that Ashley and Sage and Odin were talking about is in here. And we have, breaks and this fun activity. And then everything goes a different direction. And so, as I mentioned last time, I say that in nearly every facilitation training I do. It's not knowing what to do, it's knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. So the agenda is critical, and we always have one. And it also, you have to realize like, oh, this is the conversation that needs to happen right now. So going back to those emergent strategy elements, like we need to adapt right now. We need to see that change is happening, and we need to flow with that. Oh, this is a conversation about transformative justice, and we can't just go on like planning, like talking about strategic planning, if we're not actually backing up and figuring out ways of deepening this conversation, because that needs to happen before this other stuff can happen. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand it off to Ashley for a little bit of a stretch, and then some more space around how we create space. And feel free if there are any questions. I saw the request about the document that's not accessible. Make sure to make changes to that. And if there are any other questions, you can put them in the chat.
Great. So we're going to move into a little bit of a stretch break. So you have, I'm going to take you through some things, or I'm going to invite you to move your body and do what feels good. You are in your own home. Some of these things will feel goofy. And I want to remind you, you're in your own home. So it's not a big deal. If you want to turn your video off, you can. I'm going to leave mine on just to like model the goof. Just because I think it is important to kind of like change the energy of the space. As a facilitator, sometimes you are the vehicle for doing that. So I'm going to invite you, if it's comfortable for you to stand wherever you are, then please do so. If you want to stay seated, just adapt this as it feels good for you. And I'm going to invite you to breathe in and raise your arms above your head. And as you do that, I just want you to imagine that you are maybe like picking some apples or some sort of like delicious fruit that is like right outside. It's like just a little bit beyond your grasp. So it's a little bit of a stretch. So you're like picking some delicious fruit. And then I'm going to invite you to turn to your right. And now you're going to be like a wave of water. And you're just gonna like roll over. If you want to touch your toes, great. If you don't, that's fine. But you're just like you're just kind of making your body into a motion of a wave. So you're gonna do that twice, and then you're gonna come back up to your delicious fruit. And then to your left side, you're just gonna bend over, make a little wave twice. And keep your breath moving with it. And then you're going to come back up. And now I want you to imagine that you are a bear reaching for some honey that is like right above you. And so again, stretching. And this time when you turn in your own home, you're just going to allow yourself to make a little grunt noise as you like swat away the bees that are coming towards you. And so it's like, ugh. And like twice. Oh. So you've got your bear noise. And how many of us have been in a meeting where all we want to do is just groan through it? This is a way for you to do that as a group. So you're going to turn to your right side. Oh. Oh. And then you're going to come back and you're going to enjoy all that delicious honey from the bees who are now giving you some space. I'm going to invite you to come back to center and just like roll your shoulders back a couple times. We are sitting in front of these computers. I was in front of my computer for 8 hours yesterday on video calls. Like, so sometimes it's just really nice to just like take a moment to pause, shimmy, shake, all of these things, and give folks an ability to like just really change their breath, which can also create some spaciousness to do something different. So if you want to turn your video on, great. We're going to move into just talking about meeting agreements. And so I'm going to drop this link in the chat box. So I have a question for you all about on slide 25. I'm going to invite you all to put in the meeting agreements that you think are important for creating a brave space. So not a safe space, but a brave space for folks to be able to move through challenging conversations. And so slide 25 is a place for you to like put those in there. And we're using this, like, I wanted to do this here so that you all actually have access to a treasure trove of really good meeting agreements you can pull from later on. Slide 24, thank you, Sage. Yeah, so slide 24, I'm just gonna invite you to drop in things that you think are important meeting agreements to create a brave space. Vulnerability, yes, giving grace. Awesome, Calvin. Mindful of crosstalk. You have permission to growl like a bear. I love a Nina Simone quote and that in particular as a meeting agreement. What does it mean for us to actually hold poetry and song as components of how we want to work together, and especially in service of liberation? Yes. Challenge the idea, not the person. Express gratitude. For the share the ouch and oops, can that person explain that for folks who may not have heard that before? It's a really good one.
That was me. I can't help. I just like am even more like, yes, these are great facilitation tips. I think sometimes we can unintentionally offer something that hurts or harms someone, or we can feel hurt or harmed. And I think it's important to do both of those things, to note, ouch, that kind of hurt, and share that piece, because in the spirit of best intentions, that will stop that person ideally from ever doing that again in a meeting and building a better space. And also recognizing that, oops, sometimes we do hurt folks, and though the harm doesn't have to be forgiven, it can at least be noted and ideally changed in the future.
Someone plugged in something about fixing and then it disappeared. Who was that? What was that wise one? Oh, I see you're going to hold back. Great. Sharing your unique self. Vulnerability. Mindful of crosstalk. Great. So one of the reasons that it's important for us to set meeting agreements at the top is because this is going to enable us to hold ourselves accountable as a group to when things fall off the rails. And so when you're in a meeting and things are disruptive, an ouch happens, all of these things actually allow us to have some collective norms that we've decided on that we can then say to each other, this is actually what we're striving to do and how we're striving to be together today. So I'm curious. Yeah, of course, Sage.
I think there's a way in which the agreements help us be accountable. It also, as a facilitator, helps me because when I'm moving in ways that the group may not understand, like if we have a meeting agreement to address systemic oppressions, right? Don't let it slide. And I'm making choices like based on that, who's speaking when I'm asking folks to step back, whose voices I'm asking us to center. Then I, as a facilitator, have some accountability. So no one can be like, you are making me, sometimes participants will make it very personal, right? Like, you won't let me talk. And it's like, no, it's not about you. It's about the way that white men take up so much space in the world. And as an agreement in a community, we have said that we are going to work to try and undo some of these harms that we know exist outside of this space. So I am making a choice, yes, to center voices of women, of QT/POC folks first, because we know those are the voices that are least likely heard. Having these agreements on the front end gives me space as a facilitator when those things come up to be able to work with someone again, not dismiss their personal feelings, but also have a way for us to get back into collective and right relationship with the culture of the meeting that we're trying to create. That's all.
Awesome. Yes, Sage. Thank you. Should agreements be reviewed prior to each meeting? My take is yes, even among groups who have worked together frequently. I have one collective that we've worked together for 5 years, and still at the top of every meeting, for me, it's really important for us to like always go back to like, here's how we are really trying to be together tonight. And so, yes. And I will offer sometimes in facilitation planning, we can make assumptions about what the group thinks are going to be the norms, or what the agreements are. And so being able to clarify that right at the top is super important. I've dropped into the chat box, and this is also linked in the facilitator agenda, 2 other resources that I pull from sometimes, which are guidelines for multiracial interactions and then guidelines for a brave space. And so as you've got this slide that you all made of some really great meeting agreements, here's some other examples. And then slide 25 is, where'd that go? Tenets of principled struggle that I actually learned from Sage Crump. And in this, I've also added an additional one from Fumbling Towards Repair, a book about transformative justice and conflict. And this idea of commitment to transformative conflict. So how are we as a group really working together in service of our own growth? Great. And Catherine, yes, if you want to add in the meeting agreements from the 2019 meeting. So these are just some examples for you all and to use from and grow from as you are moving forward. I will ask that you make sure you cite your sources. So if you're using a full set of someone's agreements, please note that. And Sage, is there anything else in terms of the tenets of principled struggle in particular?
I don't think so. I think the core of the tenets for principled struggle is that we are gathered together because we have a collective direction, a collective goal. But that doesn't mean that we all have similar ideas on how to get there. And the assumption is that there's going to be struggle. And that's a beautiful thing, and not to try and overlook that. But how to be in principled struggle, right, is a very important thing. It's not just like folks sharing their ideas, but how are we in principled struggle with each other? And that I have found really helpful for a lot of spaces where you're not actually trying to bring folks from wildly different spaces together, but it's typically with people who are already in some ways aligned, but still need support in getting towards their next step. Right?
So that's setting the tone and mood for setting your room up in terms of how you're going to be together. There's also the visual world of like, what's the world that you want to create? And just a couple examples of what this can look like in both regular space, but back in like in real life space, and then also in the virtual space. I'll give an example just from the SPARCC convening from Chicago. One of the things we did was make a choice about inviting people to wear a t-shirt that was like, say it with your shirt day. And so that invitation actually created this like kind of beautiful visual picture of what that group of people, politics and special beliefs and favorite bands were. And so part of it is like kind of setting a group aesthetic. The other things you can do, I've seen some folks, especially I've seen some folks set up a camera that you may have created an altar around or dedicated to the content that you're dealing with for the day, or the people that you want to bring into the room with you. And folks who will have like a Zoom camera just for that one space, so it holds a square in your window. Other things that you can do in terms of creating the space virtually are think about breakout rooms. And this goes to what Odin was saying of what's the, are we in dyads? Are we in trios? Like, what's the conversation that needs to be had? And then how many people are going to be in it to actually make it juicy? So the conversation you all did earlier in a dyad wouldn't have been possible in 7 minutes if we had put 8 of you in a breakout room and said, go. So really thinking about in your breakouts, how to get the right number of people to address the question. The other thing I'll offer, I've seen folks do slideshows like of their places. So depending on, you can invite folks to be like, if you can change your virtual background to like represent the community where you live or your favorite place in nature, those sort of prompts can also invite folks into creating a really different visual world for your room. Any other pro tips that you all have experienced that you want to throw into the chat box, or just like unmute yourself and share of things you've seen working recently in the virtual space? Catherine, about I would say in virtual space, you actually have much more structure around how much time, and people can see their clocks in a way that they don't pay attention to when you're in real life. So like in real life, I may like cushion things, but I would say in virtual space, I do much less of that.
And I just want to comment because the way you wrote it, Catherine, like sometimes there is a way in which folks think about like, how do you get a body to do something that they don't, so like this idea of like tricking people. And I think we want to be really careful about that as facilitators. We want to be as transparent as possible. We want to, bring it out, and, part of it is, and I find this particularly with my friends who have children, right? This idea of like how to move a body, like, oh, I just try and hide the broccoli under the tater tots, right? When you're facilitating, I really suggest everything be as transparent, as above board, because if not, then it's really hard for folks. It's really hard to regain trust after folks feel like you've hoodwinked them, right? So like, that's why in the beginning, you may go through the entire agenda and why it flows the entire day, right? This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. Like making sure it brings people into the co-creation with you, and as opposed to like you being the one running it, right? So and it comes up a lot. I was in a training yesterday, and folks were like, yeah, so you trick them into, it's like, you never want to trick, because when folks feel tricked, you won't get them. I mean, you got to work really hard to get them back. I won't say you won't get them back, but it's hard.
Yes, and I will offer, as a facilitator, one of the things that I really try and do is like try and anticipate in the planning process where, let's say I'm working to design a meeting agenda and somebody's like, no, really, we only need 10 minutes. I'm going to internally, even though the agenda may say that, internally, I'm calibrating myself for like, I know that's going to take 30. And so because of who is in the room, the dynamics. And so there's that internal prep that I'm doing. And it's like, so it's not so much of a trick as it is like, how am I thinking about the cushion that's going to be needed? And in the virtual space, like those breakout rooms happen and then you just come back. So like, there's much less of that, I find, than in real life when you like are trying to wrangle the people back from the juicy thing.
And last thing I'll say about this.
Yeah,
actually,
and then Sage, it goes to you.
It goes to me. So that's perfect. The last thing I want to say about this thread is also in the same way, like, don't feel the need to apologize, right? Oftentimes you'll be in a space and the small group time has ended and folks are like, oh, okay, so I'm so sorry, there's never enough time. And we wind up reinforcing in our groups that like something untoward has happened, something didn't get to happen. And what we want to do is be on the life affirming side of being like, I hope that was a really exciting, conversation that you had. If you want to have more of it, be sure you catch up with each other in the chat, right? Or that you exchange contact information, and really kind of working through as facilitators our need to play into what might be someone else's disappointment, but really help folks see like there's a larger body that's happening, a larger thing that's happening that is still moving, right? So I also want to encourage that because that happens. A lot of times we're like, okay, everyone say sorry or take a deep breath or, and I'm like, actually, how do we continue to reinforce like what you got was amazing, right? Like so that we can see our friend Alyssa Perry says, see that you pay attention to the incremental as much as you pay attention to the monumental, right? So how do we help folks see and pay attention to and love and pull out all of the lessons, even in the incremental? So that was a poor segue into my next section, which is about the role of culture. And as you've seen, like all of us have different practices around the ways we use culture in facilitation. One of the things I want to just highlight is going back to something Odin talked about earlier is like multiple types of learners. How do people engage information for both the fact that we are in a virtual environment and the fact that we just live in Western society that preferences words, language, and writing and reading? That if we're going to be creating spaces that feel comfortable for everyone and support the different ways people engage, like using cultural practices are a beautiful way to do that. Particularly art and culture can help us get into move conversations at a bigger clip or actually leave things on the table that open up and leave things out on the table that we need to reckon with as a body. So I am going to, because as you know, if you were in the first gathering, I like tools. I like different modalities and things like that. I'm gonna drop a link to Mural in the chat. Mural we used last time, if you don't remember it. You'll get a chance to see it again. If you're new, you'll see it for the first time. And I'm gonna share my screen. Again, part of the reason I use Mural is because one, it creates an artifact of the time together. It lets people who are maybe not as comfortable speaking aloud have a way and an entryway into the conversation. And so this is our mural board for today. Just our quick tutorial again. There's a hand right here you see in the left. I'm about to click it now. It's gonna turn black so that I can move this over so we can see it better. I'm also going to make it larger. So I'm gonna take you all through an activity that I've been using since the pandemic in particular. Because one of the things that happens is we're coming into because we are so present to our current conditions, sometimes there's a need to get that out on the table or it will dominate all of your conversations throughout the time you all are together, right? So I've been using Gil Scott-Heron's Winter in America. And what I'm going to ask you all to do is do this with me. I'm going to play the song and hear the lyrics to the song. What I want you to do is, as the song plays, if there are lyrics that in the song that speak to how you are feeling, speak to what you are thinking about our current condition, the material conditions we're living in, I want you to type that into the chat. And what you're seeing and how you're seeing that play out, right? So that we can really look at our current conditions, our material conditions, as a way to start our conversation, right? Like we're like, these are the things that we know. So I'm gonna play this beautiful song, and we'll look at the lyrics while the song is playing, and we will, and you'll type into the chat different lyrics and what makes them relevant and resonant to you. Forgot to teach the hide cursors right there. That'll also clear that up. All right. And now I'm going to share just my audio so that you can look at Mural. Again, the beautiful thing about Mural is you're looking at it on your own. You don't need to, I don't need to share screen the whole time. Because all I want you to do is listen.
From the Indians who welcome the pilgrims, and to the buffaloes who once ruled the plain. Like the vultures circling beneath the dark clouds, looking for the rain, looking for the rain. Just like the cities that stagger on the coastline, in a nation that just can't stand much more. Like the forest buried beneath the highway, never had a chance to grow. Never had a chance to grow. And now it's winter. Winter in America. Yes, and all of the healers have been killed, sent away. Yeah, but the people know it's winter. Winter in America. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say. Save your soul, Lord knows, from winter in America. The Constitution, a noble piece of paper, with free society, struggle but they died in vain. And now democracy is ragtime on the corner, hoping for some rain. It looks like either hoping for some rain. And I see the robins perched in barren treetops. They're watching last-ditch races marching across the floor. But just like the peace signs that vanished in our dreams, never had a chance to grow. Never had a chance to grow. And now it's winter. Winter in America. And all of the healers have been killed or betrayed. Yeah, but the people know it's winter. Lord knows it's winter in America. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say. Save your soul.
All right, thank you everyone who dropped things into the chat. There are a lot of ways as a facilitator I could then take this conversation, right? I can start with going through the chat and what people have asked and saying like, so how do you feel you've been betrayed, or what never had a chance to grow, or people know it's winter, how do they know it's winter? And that gets a group conversation going, right? We could take it and kind of place it and say, okay, these are the things folks are feeling. These are the things we know. Now, where does our imagination take us from there? Right? A lot of the ways in which we use art and culture facilitation, it is to spark imagination, to get us to the next question. It is to pour out what people might be holding in so that they have a little more expanse and a little more space to engage in the topic of the conversation. I love what Philip wrote around, ain't nobody fighting because nobody knows what to say. I know this isn't true, but it reflects the paralysis and overwhelm. Nobody's fighting because nobody knows what to save. So you could build a whole conversation around, if that's not true, then what are we saving? If we believe that's not true. So you don't have to stick to, oh, it's winter. Like I use that and sometimes folks are like, really? Like, do we want to like just name that it's winter? But back to she's like, yes, we do. Back to this, like, you don't want to leave things off the table that are the world and the context in which we're doing all of this work. So why do people feel it's winter? Sometimes this is where you wind up in principled struggle, right? Sometimes folks are like, actually, I don't feel like it's winter. And if you don't, and you've got some folks in the room who feel like it's winter and some who feels like it, and some who feel like it's fine, then you have a larger facilitation body of work in front of you than just what we're sharing in these 4 sessions, right? Like, then you have the question of, why are these people together, right? And that's a real question to ask sometimes. So like, why are these people in a room together at a table? If we're that far apart, how are we supposed to move forward? And as much as facilitation is a superpower, we are not superheroes, and we shouldn't pretend to be, and we shouldn't be asked to be, right? Like, so you can always go back to the table, back to the non-linear and iterative. You can go back and say, I don't think this is actually the right body of people to get where you say you want to go, right? So these are all sort of options and the ways in which art and culture can help us think about and open up conversations. You can use that with videos. I love videos of different quotes of people who are speaking. I love music is always really, because we know scientifically it shifts our bodies, it shifts how we come to spaces, and we can use that intentionally in our facilitation. So I wanted to share that, and thank you all for leaning into that process, and it's just one of the things that I like to do. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to take us back to mural, because the next section I want to talk about is accessibility.
Sage, I just want to do a time check that I think we have 8 minutes.
Yep, I've got my timer on. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Let's go here. So back to our mural board, and we're going to slide over a little bit to the second section that says accessibility. One of the ways I like to think about accessibility as a facilitator is borrowing from our friends who do like architecture, this idea of universal design, right? Which basically means instead of building an agenda and then here are modifications for some people, here are modifications for these other people, here are modifications for these other people. How do you build something that works for everyone without asking folks to either necessarily out themselves or making some assumptions about the level of people's ability in the room, right? That becomes really important because I'm going to say this and I'm almost sure I'm correct, but I could be wrong, so don't help me. But I think it's 73% of all disabilities are invisible, just in terms of like how people identify. So this idea of like how to, oftentimes we think about accessibility as how are we caring for bodies, how are we caring for the things that are most obvious? But if so many disabilities are invisible, which includes neurodivergence, like how someone thinks about information, how much time they have to respond. All of these things come into play when you are facilitating spaces and things to be thinking about. So I'm offering just briefly these sort of 5 circles of ways to lean into accessibility as you are planning, and that you can populate in a little bit. So first is I'm just naming this as a facilitator because this is a facilitator training. Build spaces that actually support you as well, right? So often, like as a facilitator, you might have a need to stretch more often because, you know, your back is you know, a little skewed to the left, or, you know, you can't focus for long periods of time, or colors are challenging. So don't leave yourself out of the planning of it. Don't leave yourself out and your needs in the planning of it as you're doing that. Language justice. I say, like in other spaces of our life, you know, we'd never be in the grocery store. I'm assuming no one in this grocery store would yell at someone who was speaking another language going, speak English. We wouldn't do that, right? But yet we build facilitation spaces that do that. We build facilitation spaces that ask people to solely be in speak the way we speak, or, you know, in a particular language. So language justice becomes really important. And I say language justice, meaning different languages, and also different ways people understand information. Right? Learning styles, we talked a little bit about earlier, ensuring that when you are building agendas, that there's something for your auditory learners, for your visual learners, for your kinesthetic learners, for so that the meeting is accessible to everyone in the space. Captioning is huge, particularly for folks. And I'm a visual learner, so sometimes when I'm in spaces, there's a lot of speaking and I have a really hard time tracking like the conversation. So I typically, my personal way to navigate that is to just always have pen and paper next to me so I can kind of write quick notes to myself about what's important to me and then come back. But it's always helpful for captioning to happen. And there are 2 ways that can happen in a virtual space. You can have a live captioner, and we'll drop some ways in which some links around that, around how Zoom does that and other ways. They're also captioning what's called ASR websites, which basically you open it, it listens to your computer and it creates a transcript in real time. So you can actually create a caption for, again, I like to think about affordable options. If you can't always build in, you know, to have a captioner, you can do that as well. And then movement. Oftentimes, because we are in virtual environments, we're thinking about how we're sitting and how our bodies are positioned. And when we're building agendas, the invitation of how we move our bodies becomes really important, right? For, you know, so asking folks to do it as you can, you know, if you are able, we can say things like, stretch your shoulder muscles, you know, and this is how I'm going to do it, right? And that's an invitation for someone to stretch their shoulder muscles, how they're going to do it, right? Like it, however, and so that becomes important about how we move through space. I appreciated Ashley about the standing or sitting. I could have stood if I wanted to. I just kind of didn't want to, right? So there's also ways in which accessibility is leaning into how people feel like they want to show up, and making sure that we are building spaces that however their wholeness wants to show up, it can, and they can be engaged and feel a part of it and not need to interrupt. Or the last thing you want as a participant to feel like you are doing something just for them. Something about the human condition always makes us resist that, right? Like, I don't want, it makes me feel less than the rest of the, actually, it's not something about the human condition. It's what white supremacy, racialized capitalism, it all makes us do that, right? It makes us feel like if you have to do something just for me, then there's something wrong with me. We want to reimagine that and say, we want to create spaces that we are already careful, thinking about how we're caring for everyone. So folks don't have to feel like it is just for them, Mhm. Mhm. I started doing, so I left this up on a mural because this is for you all, these sessions are for you all to determine your facilitation process, right? To build for yourselves. And so I would encourage you to come back to this mural as homework as you're finding different movement videos, or you're finding their language justice collectives are like, how are you using this template to build your needs? Right? So whether we're together, and this is open whether we're meeting or not. Mural is here for us to use. So when we are not in space together, but you're thinking about, hopefully, you continue to think about like, what are learning styles that you can go in here and type into things. So it becomes a resource for each other, and it becomes something you can come back to over and over again to say, what's another way I can do this? What's another way I can think about this? Because you have populated an artifact for yourself that has some of that information. And I am going to see if there are questions in the last few minutes that we have on what I've shared so far. All right.
Great. In our last moments, homework for next time, slide 8 in the slide deck, there are spaces for you to include scenarios. We're going to do some work around like, what are some facilitation scenarios you're thinking about and want support around? And we're going to use those as part of our work for our next session. And your homework is just to think about, what do you want your facilitation practice to look and feel like? So as Sage mentioned, we're giving you like a wide variety of tools and resources and things to think about, but it's also up to you personally to figure out like what your own style is going to be. And so just if you can either put it in the chat box, we'll come back to this question next time. And yeah, I think those are my questions. Send us scenarios and think about your style or flair, whatever is going to work for you. And then we'll see you in yes, Sage?
I was going to say, for instance, I always need a good accessory. It just makes me feel good.
Exactly.
What I learned from Wonder Woman.
Cool. So we will see you all in 2 weeks, and we'll send you a reminder and a bunch of resources. And that's where we are today, friends.
Great.